next session we have lined up for all of you is a very, very interesting session, very close to the heart for all of us. The name of the book is The Pashtuns, A Contested History. And why that is all very relevant to us is because somewhere deep inside, once we get seated, and also in the interest of all the history buffs over here, I know I am one, and I've been reading up a lot, including some of the younger audience here. So may I now invite Mr. Tilak Devasher and Ambassador Ajay Bisaria to please join us on stage to begin with our next session. So please, let's put our hands together, everybody, and welcome our speakers on stage. Sitting here in the heart of Delhi on a very cool afternoon, each one of us may have a very emotional story to tell and points of debate when we hear the words partition. Similarly, a single line, the Durand Line, drawn by the British also changed the lives of one of the largest ethnic groups in the world, the Pashtuns, between Afghanistan and Pakistan, and left them without a country to call their own. While exploring the geographical context of the Pashtuns, their characteristics and social customs, the nuanced treatments that Tilak Devasher gives brings out how a common Pashtun identity does exist. The meat of the book is a study of three separate and overlapping relationships: the Pashtuns in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, and finally the Pashtuns in the interface between Pakistan and Afghanistan, and in Pashtunistan in their strife for peace and prosperity. With the various aspects of geopolitical history with world powers like Russia and the US at play, the book fulfills a gap in the geopolitical understanding of South Asia. Today I have with me the author of this book, Pashtuns, A Contested History, Mr. Tilak Devasher, right here. His book comes close to the heels of two very well-researched books on Pakistan's history and the evolution of its polity. A little bit about his career. He's been a special secretary, Government of India. Hopefully you were social as well. And in his career with the Cabinet Secretariat, he specialized in security issues pertaining to India's neighborhood. He's written articles for various national newspapers and magazines, and has also appeared on TV shows on leading news channels. He's currently a member of the National Security Advisory Board, consultant Vivekanand International Foundation, and a distinguished fellow at United Services Institution of India. With him, I have Mr. Ajay Bisaria, a former civil servant who has had a distinguished diplomatic career spanning 35 years, dealing with some of India's key economic and security relationships. He served as the High Commissioner of India to Canada and has been India's envoy in Pakistan, Poland, and Lithuania. He's also represented India at the World Bank in Washington, D.C., and in embassies in Berlin and Moscow. He has served in various capacities in India in the Ministry of External Affairs, Department of Commerce, and as a key aide to Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee from 1999 to 2004. He's also published and lectured on issues related to trade, finance, and geopolitics with a focus on South Asia, Eurasia, Central Asia, and Canada. Ladies and gentlemen, I hand over to Mr. Ajay Bisaria and to Mr. Tilak Devasher the rest of the very interesting 1 hour of conversation with them. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Welcome to this afternoon session. In a sense, this session is about a continuation of the last session because this is a book about which the movie has already been made. You saw the movie Pathan with Shah Rukh Khan. This is the backstory. So I think this is the closest we are going to come at the Vasant Vihar LitFest to interviewing Shah Rukh Khan about the movie Pathan, but this is really about what gave birth to the background of that particular movie. But let me start by complimenting the organizers and thanking you for calling us today. This is my first time at the Vasant Vihar LitFest, and I think it's a very, very positive story. If a neighborhood can have a LitFest, it speaks to the kind of people staying here, the love for books, and the love for literature. So it's wonderful to be here at this event. And what we are talking about a very important book and an important issue, which also has a great deal of contemporary relevance. And of course, we're going to be talking of what Mr. Deveshar's book calls the largest ethnic group without their own country. So this is their story that we're going to discuss. I'm not going to introduce the author again. Yeah, you know, he's been introduced already. But all I would add is that he has decades of experience as an analyst and an intelligence officer in the Cabinet Secretariat. And often you would find diplomats are more in the public eye, and analysts and intelligence officers tend to be faceless, anonymous, invisible. But what Tilak's work after he retired demonstrates the kind of excellence and the meticulous way he would have analyzed issues while he was in service. This is, as we said, Tilak's fourth book. In 2016, he brought out his first book, which was very presciently called Pakistan Courting the Abyss. Presciently because today Pakistan faces a poly-crisis. It is staring at that abyss. And this was a book about that. When I was posted as Indian High Commissioner in Pakistan in 2017, that was one of the first books I read. It was a great reference book on the internal dynamics of Pakistan. He followed it up with a book called Pakistan at the Helm, which is a bunch of delightful anecdotes about Pakistan's leaders from Jinnah onwards. And then came the third book in 2019, which is called The Balochistan Conundrum. And after that, of course, in 2022, The Pashtuns, A Contested History. So I think Tilak's books fill a very important gap in our understanding of our Western neighborhood, because a lot of the information that you would be getting and consuming, particularly in our media, is a very emotive, opinion-based analysis rather than an impassioned kind of a dispassionate look at events. So I thought what we would do in this conversation is begin by asking the author to perhaps just paint a picture of what this book is all about initially, before we get on to a Q&A and a discussion about the contemporary relevance of the issues he talks about, and then open it up for your questions. So Tilak, may I invite you to please talk about the book, and perhaps by addressing whether you really gave Shah Rukh Khan the idea of making Pathan.
Thank you so much. Ajay, thank you for the kind words, and I join you in complimenting the organizers, especially General Shankar Prasad, for the energy and enthusiasm with which he organizes these festivals. This is my second time I'm here in the Vasant Vihar Literary Fest, and I'm always been impressed by the organization and the enthusiasm of the residents over here. So let me begin with the clarification. I have nothing to do with Shah Rukh Khan or the Pathans. I, in fact, didn't even know that such a movie was being made, just as I'm sure some of his colleagues would not be aware of the fact that there is a book called The Pashtuns. And for those who do both, read the Pathans and the Pashtuns, I hope will realize which is a real story. So let me begin by saying that my book, Pashtuns, The Contested History, this is my fourth book, as you mentioned, in which I talk about the Pashtun ethnic identity that straddles Afghanistan and Pakistan. Though no study of a people can be divorced from the countries in which they reside, This book is not in the main about either Afghanistan or Pakistan. This is about the Pashtuns. This is their story. In this book, I seek answers to questions like who are the Pashtuns? Where did they come from? What are their religious, cultural, and social mores and beliefs? What is Pashtunwali, the way of the Pashtun? And what is the relationship between Pashtunwali and Islam? I then talk about a century of contact that the British had with the Pashtuns, the Durand Line, Ghaffar Khan and the politics of partition. I talk about developments in Afghanistan, including the Saur Revolution, the Soviet invasion, the Mujahideen, the Civil War, the rise to power of the Taliban in the 1990s. I then go on to talk about the US invasion in 2001. I talk about the defeat of the Taliban, the resurgence of the Taliban, and Taliban being back in power in Kabul in 2021, and the incubation of the Al-Qaeda and the ISKP, and the dubious role that Pakistan has played in all these developments. There are three questions that I'm frequently asked about the book. One, why did I write the book? Second, why did I write about the people rather than the countries in which they reside? And third, what is so contested about the Pashtuns? So let me just briefly answer these questions. See, the Pashtuns matter, and they matter vitally. Understanding of the Pashtuns, of their culture and their way and their belief, as I mentioned earlier, is vital for peace and stability in this very critical area in our neighborhood. Superficial understanding and superficial prescriptions have led to devastating consequences in the past. And if there is peace, if there is violence, if there is instability in this crossroads of our neighborhood, this will radiate outwards and lead to a further surge of refugees, further violence, drugs, ungoverned spaces in which international terrorists will incubate. Therefore, I decided to study this very critical population to see what are the various issues which are affecting them. The second question which I was asked is on why about the people and not the countries? And the answer is that the land of the Pashtuns, Pashtunistan, spans about 100,000 square miles and historically stretched from the Indus to the Hindu Kush mountains. It had a common governance from 1747 to 1834 when the Sikhs under Maharaja Ranjit Singh tore off the portion of it from the Indus to the Khyber. This portion was inherited by the British and then passed on to Pakistan in 1947. Today, the Pashtuns are divided between Afghanistan and Pakistan by the controversial British era Durand Line, a mention of which was made earlier. Though the Pashtuns are divided between two countries, they share a common ideology of dissent, a common religion, common code, as I mentioned, common language, ethnicity, cultural and linguistic and familial bonds. This makes it easy to see them as a single entity inhabiting a single piece of real estate. That is why I discuss and write about the people rather than the countries in which they reside. Moreover, the present division of the Pashtuns is just one of the many avatars that this land has seen over the centuries. The fact that the Afghans are one nation, Afghans and Pashtuns are used interchangeably, and so as is Pathan. So the fact that the Afghans are one nation is best represented by a Pashto phrase, Laro Bar Yo Afghan, which means Lar as the lowlands of Pakistan and the High as the highlands of Afghanistan are one. This is also the key slogan of the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement. And the third question, why a contested history? And the reason is that this land has been contested between empires for centuries. And in fact, this land has seen more invasions than any other in Asia, or perhaps even in the world. Right from the Persians to the Greeks, to the Kushans, to the Sakas, to the Huns, to the Mongols, the Arabs, the Turks, the Mughals, the British, the Soviets, the Americans, all have invaded this land for one reason or the other. All have tried to subdue and conquer this land and ultimately failed, giving this land the moniker of graveyard of empires. And the reason they failed was that you cannot defeat a people who do not know the meaning of defeat in the classical sense. The Pashtuns know how to survive. They know when to run, they know when to hide, they know when to talk, and they know when to fight, but as per Afghan time. So these invasions have bred a very tough and hardy people who have a unique way of life and a unique way of seeing the world. But who are the Pashtuns? Where did they come from? there continues to be a debate among scholars who are the Pashtuns or the origins of the Pashtuns. And the various theories vary between a Semitic origin as being one of the lost tribes of Israel and an Indo-Aryan inception. While scholars continue to debate, many attempts have been made to codify Pashtun genealogies. The most famous of this was one by Nematullah Harawi in India, who was commissioned by Jahangir in 1613 to codify the genealogies. As per these genealogies, the Pashtuns claim descent from a single common ancestor, Qais bin Rashid or Qais Abdul Rashid, who went to Medina in 622 and was converted to Islam by the Prophet. He came back and then spread Islam all over the Pashtun lands. This is an article of faith, and the Pashtuns start their lineage or their history from the conversion in 622. The entire history before that is forgotten and buried. Thus, the Hindu Shahi kingdoms of Kabul, the Buddhist kingdom in Bamiyan, the Zoroastrian influence at Ghazni is all sort of forgotten and not catered for. It's just that when they turn to Islam. I'll just mention one of the very peculiar features of the Pashtuns, which is Pashtun Wali, which I mentioned I made earlier. This is an unwritten set of codes, cultural codes, way of behavior of the Pashtuns, which in its totality represents the Pashtun ideal of a Gairatmand Pashtun, or a Pashtun who lives an honorable life. At its core, Pashtun Wali is about Nang, or honor, based on the triangle of Zan, Zar, Zameen, which is women, gold and land. One of the key elements of Pashtun Wali is Badal, or revenge. As the Pashtun saying goes, he is not a Pashtun who does not give a blow in return for a pinch. There is also no time limit for revenge. A Pashtun who took revenge after 100 years said, I took it too quickly. Two other elements of Pashtun Wali, one is Melmastia, which is hospitality, and Nanvati, which is refuge. These two concepts are so important that at times they even trump revenge, as seen in the offering of food and shelter to even the bitterest enemy who seeks refuge. An example of this was Mullah Omar, when even the Islamic nations told him that he must hand over Osama bin Laden to either Saudi Arabia or to Pakistan for trial because of the 9/11 bombings. He said, where is the question? I'm not talking about Sharia, but I'm talking about Pashtun Wali. As per Pashtun Wali, he has sought refuge with me, and there is no way I'll hand him over to anybody, and I'll continue to protect him. So that's how strong Pashtun Wali is. So I'll stop here and carry on the discussion and answer any questions that you'll have.
Thank you. Thank you, Tilak, for that. So I think drawing from the last idea that you mentioned about revenge, when the Taliban takes over in Afghanistan in the 90s and now Taliban 2.0 now, so does that end the desire for revenge because they've got their own land back? Does it work that way in your view?
It may work for them. It doesn't work for the others who are not in the system. Because it's not an inclusive government. It's a military victory being not inclusive. So people who have been left out, this is what happened in the 90s. In the 90s, after the Taliban were defeated, many of them came up to Karzai and to the US and wanted to lay down their weapons and become, join the mainstream and give up politics. The people who the Taliban had displaced in the Pashtuns, they said nothing of the sort. We are going to fix these guys. I think that was a big mistake. Had the Taliban been allowed to enter the mainstream in 2001, 2002, Afghanistan would not have seen a 20-year war. But because of this revenge, they said, we are going to fix these guys. So when ultimately these lot of Taliban are removed, as surely they will, because it's a military victory. It's not an inclusive government. Even among the Pashtuns, it's not an inclusive government. Those guys will take revenge. It is, of course, it's a different matter. The Taliban will also take revenge against Pakistan because they have many scores to settle with Pakistan. But here, it will not end just now.
Right. One of the most interesting contemporary questions is this whole Pakistan-Afghanistan relationship. And I see that you mention on page 173 of this book that Pakistan could fast become the next victim of this graveyard of empires, since the basic flaw in Pakistan's policy has been to underestimate the Afghans. So how do you think Pakistan keeps underestimating the Afghans all the time?
You see, it started very early. You'd be surprised that in 1959, Ayub Khan told the visiting US President Eisenhower that the Afghans are not Muslims nearly as much as they are opportunists. Now, this shows the trend in Pakistan that here was a country that came into existence 12 years before, and Afghanistan had been in the making from 1747. And the Afghans had been more longer Muslims for a longer period of time than some of the ethnic groups in Pakistan. Yet, the Pakistan leader thought it fit to say that the Afghans are not Muslim as they are opportunists. Now, this was compounded by the perception that came out into the army that Pakistan's help in the Mujahideen victory against the Soviet Union entitled it to determine who would rule in Kabul or who would not rule in Kabul. In fact, Zia in an interview said that we have earned the right to have a very friendly government in Kabul. We have taken risks as a frontline state, and therefore we will not allow a country which has influence of India and Russia to dominate affairs or have claims on our territory. So this is the kind of patronizing attitude which was reinforced by the Mujahideen. Then there is the fact that Afghanistan is a landlocked country, and anytime Pakistan wants, it can choke the transit and literally starve, because Karachi is the only port that the Afghans can use. Similarly, they will block the trading points at Chaman and Torkham, not allow trade from Afghanistan, and Afghanistan depends on that trade. So these are the way in which they have underestimated the Afghans and said, we can take them. But there is a deeper reason, and that reason is Pakistan's insecurity vis-a-vis the Durand Line. Since 47, Pakistan has been apprehensive about the rise of Pashtun nationalism in Pakistan as a result of Ghaffar Khan articulating the quest for Pashtunistan, and Afghan irredentism raised by leaders like Muhammad Dawood, who talked about reclaiming the territories which had been lost to the British and inherited by Pakistan, and a link between these two Pashtun nationalisms. In 1949, Loya Jirga in Afghanistan had rescinded the Durand Line Agreement and all other agreements with British India. And this is something which no Afghan government since 1949 has gone back on, whether a monarchy, a republic, communists, Mujahideen, or even the Taliban. Everybody has said that we do not recognize the Durand Line. Now, Pakistan is aware of this. This is a huge fault line in Pakistan. So they have tried for the last 7 decades to somehow undermine Pashtun nationalism, either by leveraging the very deeply religious emotions of the Pashtuns, trying to engineer a weak and dependent government in Kabul that would recognize the Durand Line and also keep India at bay. Now, this worked under Zia because of the Soviet invasion. He was able to transform Pashtun identity from ethnicity to religion. He did this by encouraging pan-Islamism, using Saudi and US money, opened up madrasas that brought in Wahhabi sort of ideology, trained the Mujahideen. Now, this had tactical success because for some time it calmed Pakistan's fears. But in the long term, it has had disastrous effects on Pakistan. This refugees, drugs, the Kalashnikov culture, radicalization of Pashtun society, in fact, the disruption of Pashtun society, and allowing terrorists like Osama bin Laden to incubate over there. So over the long term, it has had disastrous implications for Pakistan. And now, with the TTP having come to the fore, Pakistan is actually faced with a pincer Pashtun movement. The Taliban don't recognize the Durand Line, and they've called it an unresolved issue. That means the territorial integrity of Pakistan is threatened. And the TTP want to establish their own regime in the erstwhile federally administered tribal areas. So if Pakistan doesn't get its act together and plays this out with acumen, they could face a larger Pashtun uprising on both sides of the Durand Line. Therefore, Pakistan could well be the next victim.
So I think this is really interesting because Pakistan's whole idea of trying to bring back the Taliban was to get that strategic depth and to have India out of Afghanistan in terms of influence. But now the opposite seems to have happened, that it is the TTP that is getting the strategic depth. So, it's one of the ironies of history. But moving on from Pakistan, the other a major power that has been a huge influence in this region has been the United States, at least since after 79 when the Soviets came in. The US, as part of its new great game or looking for a sphere of influence, has been present. And you talk about this in your book, and you talk of the US exit from Kabul on the 31st of August 21, where after spending $2 trillion, losing blood and treasure in the longest US war of 20 years, the US left. But you also mentioned that the US had decided to leave a decade earlier, about 2009-10. So what took the US so long to actually get out after having made that tactical decision to move out a decade earlier?
Yeah, a couple of reasons. 2009-10, they decided that they need to have talks with the Taliban. So if you recall, an office was opened in Doha for this purpose, but Karzai threw a fit because the Taliban called it Embassy of the Islamic Emirate of, he said nothing of the, there can be no embassy apart from the Islamic Republic. So talks broke down very quickly enough. Then Osama bin Laden had not been neutralized. And the US, the main purpose of coming there was to find. So when Osama bin Laden was neutralized in May 2011, the US could well have left then. But that's when President Obama shifted the goalpost, and he says that we also need to deal with the terror sanctuaries in Pakistan. So this whole AFPAC strategy was crafted, which established a linkage between the Taliban insurgency and safe havens in Waziristan, and led to the surge, led to drone strikes. So US kept getting sucked into Afghanistan. And they couldn't up and leave a very messy situation. Ultimately, when they left, it was a very messy situation. But if they didn't leave in 2011, then they were stuck there for good. There were also a couple of other reasons. You see, the amazing success of Operation Enduring Freedom bred complacency and hubris in the US. So Donald Trump could announce in 2003, mission accomplished, very pompously. Very much like the British, who after the first and second Afghan wars...
Bush made that announcement, yeah.
It's Rumsfeld, I thought.
Rumsfeld?
Yeah, okay. The defense secretary. Like the British after the first and second Afghan wars, announced in parliament, victory, this and that. They didn't realize what Afghan time is. Afghan will react in his own time. Mm-hmm. The second was, probably the US didn't even know what they were doing in Afghanistan. No less a person than three-star General Donald Lute, who was the White House czar of Afghanistan in the Bush and Obama presidencies. He said we were devoid of a fundamental understanding of Afghanistan. We didn't know what we were doing there. You say this in 2015, 14 years you've been there. And further documents released by Washington Post and others show the US just did not know what its end game was in Afghanistan. In fact, Hossein Haqqani puts this across brilliantly. He said the US had 21-year plans, but they did not have a single 20-year plan. So because of this, the US just didn't know how to get out. And how could they declare victory? If they didn't declare victory in 2011, when they killed Osama bin Laden, they were just stuck there for the long term.
Right. And the US exit was celebrated by Pakistan. The then DGISI went and had cups of tea with the Taliban when they came in. So 18 months later, after that exit, it does seem that that celebration was premature, because the general understanding is that the Pakistanis had three asks from the Afghan Taliban. One was to recognize the Durand Line, the second was to rein in the TTP, and the third was to keep the Indians out. So it turns out that all three haven't been met, because the Indians are back in with their coordination mission. The TTP is super active, declared war on Pakistan, and the Durand Line is not recognized at all. So do you think this has been bad news for Pakistan, and they were better off with the US being there?
I think extremely bad news. You see, once again, I think the people who understand the Pashtuns the most are Pakistanis. Neighbors speaking the language, same population on both sides. Yet their analysis of the situation and how to deal with the Pashtuns is probably the worst. Simple thing. The TTP and the Taliban have very, very strong relationship. when the Taliban was thrown out of Afghanistan, they sought shelter in Waziristan. And it was the tribesmen who gave them shelter, refuge, logistic support, and even fought with them against the Americans. Today, when the TTP is under pressure, as per Pashtun Wali, the Taliban have no option but to support them and give them food, shelter, and what they had done. I don't know how Pakistan didn't get it. Similarly, with the Durand Line, the fact is that no Afghan government since 1949, and they should have been aware of this, will ever recognize the Durand Line. The Taliban, in fact, have gone a step ahead and said this is an unresolved issue. You know, this divides the nation. Likewise with India, you see, Pakistan, I think the Taliban realize that Pakistan can't do the heavy lifting for the Taliban. Whether it is in terms of getting international recognition, whether it is in terms of economic development, whether it is in terms of humanitarian assistance, who is the big daddy in the neighborhood? You know, it is India. So they have invited India back into Kabul and asked us to continue with those infrastructure projects and even offer to send military people for. So I think Pakistan totally miscalculated. Very bad analysis and assessment of the situation. Maybe just it was Punjabi hubris, is underestimating the Afghans again. That, you know, we've looked after them for 20 years, they jolly well do what we want to. You see, a Pashtun in opposition and a Pashtun in power are totally different kettle of fish. Now there are families of them, they're no longer hostage to the Pakistanis. So Pakistan is finding out what a tough situation it is.
And Pakistan itself is going through a huge poly-crisis now. It has an economic crisis, a political crisis, an ecological crisis, and of course a security crisis with the TTP. So in strategic circles, people are talking of scenarios, and one of them is the breakup of Pakistan, because it is fast becoming in many ways a dysfunctional state. Will it become an unviable state and break up? So in that context, how likely is a scenario of united Pashtunistan forging itself, getting elements of Afghanistan and Pakistan together and getting the territory that the Pashtuns always wanted?
So that's a very interesting and a very fascinating question. You see, there are arguments on both sides. One hand, even though you have Pashtun nationalism in Pakistan and you have a Pashtun nationalism in Afghanistan, they both originate from a single Pashtun tribalism. Right. You know, and the Pashtun tribes continues to have transnational linkages. I mentioned earlier about religion, about common descent, common code, Pashtun Wali, cultural, linguistic, familial bonds. So that is the pull factor. But on the other hand, there is no common vision of what Pashtunistan means. There are at least three proposals on the table, or have been for the last 70 years. One is the Pashtun areas of Pakistan and the Pashtun areas of Afghanistan coming together in a larger Pashtunistan. The second idea is unification of all the Pashtuns in Afghanistan with in Pakistan with provincial autonomy. And the third option is that the Pashtuns of Pakistan joining Afghanistan into a greater Afghanistan. Now, there is no clarity because people have arguments for all these three. And unless and until Pashtun intellectuals develop a common vision for Pashtunistan, which is acceptable to the political leadership, the polarized political leadership, and the people, it's going to be difficult to articulate something collective. The other problem is that the Pashtuns in Afghanistan are well integrated into the Pakistani system, whether the top echelons of the army, whether in terms of trade. Karachi, after all, is the largest Pashtun city in the world. The Pashtuns settled in KPK are far more developed than the Pashtuns in Afghanistan or in the tribal areas. The Islamic clerics stress a pan-Islamic identity, not a tribal or ethnic identity. So there are these difficulties. I think two critical factors will be there. One will be how does the Taliban develop in the future and what it does with the idea of the Durand Line. Today they have opposed it. They have called it as dividing a nation. But do they carry this forward? And what will their view be about Pashtunistan? So how the Taliban react is going to be very critical. Second is the TTP. The TTP is, if you notice, gradually changing its ideology from purely Sharia-based into a ethno-nationalist ideology. And they are talking about nationalism, they are talking about the FATA areas. And if the Taliban and the TTP were actually to unite and tie up, then it could have a different connotation altogether.
And could the PTM,
Yes.
the Tahaffuz movement, also become a catalyst for pushing this process forward?
Yeah. Now the PTM is really the joker in the pack. The reason is, when anybody picks up a gun, it's easier for the Pakistan army to go after them, difficult as it may be. The PTM is a strange kettle of fish. It's like the Khudai Khidmatgars of Ghaffar Khan. They're non-violent. They're not a political party. They're not a political movement. I mean, they're a political movement. They want the same constitutional rights for the Pashtuns as the Punjabis and the Sindhis have. They said, we don't want to be treated as cannon fodder for your foreign policy goals. You treat us, give us the same rights. Get these terrorists out of Waziristan. Remove the landmines. We no longer want to be treated like that. So the Pakistan army does not know how to deal with the PTM, being a civil rights movement. See, as the saying goes, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So what the Pakistan army will probably do is bash these guys, which is the worst thing they can do. Now, if they were also to tie up on a Pashtun larger platform with the Taliban, with the TTP, and the mainstream Pashtun parties like the ANP, the Pashtunkhwa Milli Awami Party, the PPP, and the Muslim League in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, that's a very strong witch's brew, and you never know what will happen then.
Right, so great deal of uncertainty there. So I think I'd like to open it up for questions from the audience. But before that, a question for you. You've written 4 books on Pakistan, Baloch, nationalism, in a sense about Pashtun nationalism. So what next? Are you going to write about the Sindhis and the Punjabis too, or do you have some books in mind?
Yeah, I have a couple of ideas. I'm very tempted to do a book on Punjab. Being a Punjabi myself, I was amazed when I was posted there at the animosity which the other minorities have towards Punjabis. And I said, hey, being a Punjabi from India, that's not the same. So the Punjabi in Pakistan has gone berserk in terms of oppressing, taking the resources away from the smaller provinces. So it's a fascinating study. You see, Punjab is a home to 3 major religions of the world: Hinduism, Sikhism, Islam. 1 language but 3 different scripts. At one time, Punjab stretched from Delhi to the Khyber Pass, before NWFP was separated. So there is a lot of churning that is going on inside Punjab too, which will be fascinating. Very difficult book to do. But let's see. I haven't sort of got on to my ideas yet. I'm still promoting my Pashtuns book.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So I think we should open it up for questions in the time we have. Yes, please. The gentleman in the middle, in the cap.
Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, he was a Pashtun. In 47, he expected India to include Balochistan in India. And he was disappointed with the Indian leaders. Do you think India made a mistake by not including Balochistan in India?
You mean Afghanistan?
No.
The Pashtun area?
Pashtun area.
Yeah, you see...
Ghaffar Khan was excluded from this Indian coronation.
Yeah, one thing is, one can't look at history or historical developments in the rearview mirror or by hindsight. But you are right. You see, when the partition plan was actually approved, Ghaffar Khan got a shock. You see, the NWFP was a bit of a problem for Congress, Muslim League and the British. It was a 96% Muslim majority province, the largest Muslim majority province. But it had a Congress Khudai Khidmatkar government, which had voted for them in 1946. For the Congress, it was a crucial province to prove that they represented all of India and not just the Hindu majority. For the same reason, for the Muslim League, it was very important that the Muslim League government should be in NWFP. So that's how Jinnah can claim to be representative of all Muslims. If he couldn't represent a 96% Muslim majority province, then the whole argument fell flat. That was the same problem for the British. For the British had made up their mind of partitioning Hindu India and a Muslim Pakistan. But if NWFP stayed with the Congress and voted for India, the whole partition plan and the rationale for partition would fall flat. So, though elections were held in 1946, Mountbatten insisted that there should be a referendum for NWFP whether they would accede to India or accede to Pakistan. And Ghaffar Khan protested. They said, we've just held elections in 46 on the same issue of partition. How can you go back to the same? For reasons, I think, which are buried in the pages of history, the Congress agreed to this referendum proposal. And Ghaffar Khan was shocked, as you said. And he told Gandhiji, you have thrown us to the wolves. Aapne humse pucha bhi nahi. And he was in Delhi. His brother Khansa was in Delhi. They weren't even asked, and the Congress went ahead and accepted the referendum. So very disappointed and broken, Ghaffar Khan went back to Peshawar. And they boycotted the referendum, saying, if there is to be a referendum, then it must be with the option of Pashtunistan. This the British refused to do. Congress central leadership didn't support him, so the Congress local party supported him. They boycotted it, and the rest is history. So that is a very unfortunate chapter at that time of partition. In fact, Ghaffar Khan's son Ghani Khan asked Gandhiji. Gandhiji had said that, we'll look after you in case Pakistan doesn't do you justice. We'll look after you. And Ghani Khan asked him, then what happens to your non-violence? And Gandhiji said, I am non-violent, but India is not non-violent, so we'll look after you. And Ghaffar Khan in the 60s told Gandhiji's personal secretary, Gandhiji's promise has not been kept to us. And you owe us to make amends for that promise which has been unfulfilled. And Indira Gandhi also, in the foreword to one of the books on Ghaffar Khan, said that we really hope that Ghaffar Khan, in his magnanimity, was able to forgive us for the betrayal that we did at the time of partition.
Right. Yes, you have the mic already.
I got your perspective on an issue which I don't know, you would know more than me. We have a friend here called Mr. Atul Gupta. For the past 6 years, he's been posted in Kabul with the UN team over there, and he's been through it all. He comes here every 6-7 weeks for 2 weeks. That's their service condition. And we meet. And he made something very startling. He says, there is a Taliban government. They have an ideology. They don't waver from their ideology, whatever be the cost. But there is not a word of corruption. He says, we went with them for a deal in Abu Dhabi. When they saw the calculations, they said, what is this? And they said, this is what we have to give you. They said, just cut it out. We don't want it. Reduce the price. So maybe both of you, you've been in Islamabad and you've studied the subject so intimately, you know the Taliban better. What would be your perspective on how truthful is this?
Yeah, I think I would agree what he had said. But you see, a single agenda cannot determine, or a single point cannot determine the government. They are not corrupt, agreed. But their ideological impulses and the way they are governing Taliban, the Taliban are governing Afghanistan, is something which the international community will not accept. They will praise them for there being no corruption. But what they are doing with the women, for example, the education, not allowing them to work, the kind of non-inclusive government. So all these are issues which also have to be factored in when you assess and evaluate a government.
Yeah, I think in the big picture, what we find 18 months after the Taliban took over is that it's not as bad as we feared. Because if we had a benchmark of the government of the 90s, that was a terrible Taliban government in the 90s in terms of its export of terror to India. So from India's point of view, the benchmark would be not just internal governance. As Tilak said, that would be the way they treat women, education, health, and so on. But also in the way they govern themselves and give representation to other sections of Afghan society. So they don't come up to those benchmarks, but at least, as you're saying, they are not as corrupt as we feared, and they are not exporting terror the way we expected them to be. There is no civil war going on. So these are small mercies, given what it is. But I would take your friend's account to be authentic. I don't know if that anecdote adds up to data of no corruption anywhere. It's a non-transparent system. We're not getting too much data out of that. Thank you. Young man in front, please.
Do you think that eventually the Pashtun Wali will be made obsolete by Sharia law and Islam?
See, Pashtunwali predates Sharia by centuries. Islam came in the 7th, 8th, 9th centuries. Pashtunwali, as you know, Wali Khan said in the National Assembly of Pakistan, I've been a Pashtun for 4,000 years, a Muslim for 1400 and a Pakistani for 40. So for the Pashtuns, Pashtunwali, their social codes, their cultural codes, their behavior, the concept of honor, these predate Islam and predate Sharia. It has been damaged because of the Wahhabi influence and because of constant warfare. But it will not. I don't see Pashtunwali disappearing.
Yes, lady at the back, please.
Yeah. So my question is in a different strand. You started by saying that you're doing some sort of an anthropological, sociological genesis of who the Pashtuns are, where they came from, what their belief systems are. And I got interested in that. So I wanted to know from you, has their attitude towards women been like this from the very beginning? Or was it forced Islamization which led to that? And what is the resistance to modernity?
You see, good question. Let me tell you, in the 1920s, King Amanullah Khan started girls' education. He forced women to take off the veil and gave a lot of empowerment as far as women were concerned. Because it was a conservative society, it meant resistance. Right? The Taliban are an aberration. It is neither as per Sharia, otherwise 50 Islamic countries would have the same system as Taliban have. Neither is it as per Pashtunwali. It is their own very peculiar brand of Deobandi, Wahhabi, their own ideology. You see the problem which the Al-Azhar scholars came to talk to them when they were destroying the Bamiyan Buddhas, and they reported back that because the Taliban did not know Arabic, they had not studied the original Quran, they did not know linguistics, their knowledge of Islamic jurisprudence was very, very limited and poor. So what is happening to women in Afghanistan is a peculiarly Taliban phenomena. It is not a Pashtun phenomena, it is not a Sharia phenomena.
Just to add to that story, there was a very interesting incident at the United Nations recently when there was a huge pushback on the way Taliban was treating women, and the Pakistan permanent representative at the UN stood up and he read out a statement. He said, this is part of our culture, this is part of Pashtun culture. There was such a huge pushback within Pakistan, and the kind of issues that you talked about were raised in terms of the history. He had to apologize at the United Nations and said, no, I didn't mean Pashtun culture, I meant Taliban culture. So I think that distinction is important to make. Yes, the lady at the back.
I think last question, we are running out of time.
Last question.
Sirs, मेरा क्वेश्चन नहीं है, मेरा रिक्वेस्ट है आप लोग दोनों से, सिंस बोथ ऑफ यू आर एसोसिएटेड विद द ICS एसोसिएशन एंड कैबिनेट सेक्रेटेरिएट गवर्नमेंट ऑफ इंडिया, सो माय रिक्वेस्ट इज़ कि आप लोग रिकग्नाइज करें कि जो इज़राइल का न्यू ईयर है दैट कोइंसाइड्स विद हमारा नवरात्र न्यू ईयर. सो माय रिक्वेस्ट इज़ कि इंडिया शुड टेक द ट्रबल टू विश देम हैप्पी न्यू ईयर. अभी उन्होंने हमारे को कितना हेल्प किया था जब हमारे यहाँ बीमारियाँ थी, हमें वायल्स चाहिए थे, तो हम उसका थैंक्स में हम उनको हैप्पी न्यू ईयर क्यों नहीं बोल सकते हैं? व्हाई इज दिस डिफरेंस फ्रॉम इंडिया टू विश देम? और हम मन की बात कहते हैं, जो हमारे ताइवान है उन्होंने कुछ चीज़ें बहुत अच्छी करी हैं. अपना एक्सपोर्ट वैक्स एप्पल्स का जो वो एक्सपोर्ट करते हैं, हमारे पास इतने वैक्स एप्पल्स हैं, हम एक भी एक्सपोर्ट नहीं करते हैं. वो इतने से उनके पास है, वो इतना बढ़िया से एक्सपोर्ट करते हैं. तो इंडिया शुड अप्रिशिएट, वी शुड स्क्रैच देयर बैक. कभी ना कभी तो वो भी तो हमारा बैक, हमें भी तो जरूरत पड़ेगी हमारा बैक स्क्रैच होने के लिए.
Thank you, ma'am. We've noted this. So thank you for your advice. Thank you very much. You've been a great audience. I'm sorry we've run out of time, but thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for a very exciting session. I think all of us are going to be very curious and want to research this, this piece of information we've got, that's the book. You have all the books available at the back. Kunzum store is making the books available, and he will be available to give you an author-signed copy as well. So make sure you get that. But before we end, we wanted to present a small memento for their participation in our session at the Vasant Vihar LitFest. May I call upon Mrs. Usha Gupta to please present the memento. A big round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. I know it is tea time. Let's once more, big round of applause. Come on. We have tea and coffee available at the back as well. It's a good time to grab a hot cup of tea or a coffee, and then we will continue with our next session, which is scheduled for 5 o'clock. Which is called Diamonds for Everyone, Technology and Innovations.